Depending on who you ask, because I think only about half of the audience feels this way, but seemingly all of the critics do, Fire Country had the perfect series finale, and now we're going to be going into season 5 with the new showrunner where no one quite knows what's going on. And I mean, it does have all the trappings of a perfect series finale if I've ever seen one. We get Jake getting married to Violet, his girlfriend for the past year. He doesn't seem to realize until it's time to exchange rings that Bodhi doesn't have the rings as Jake had assumed, which is a problem because Bodhi assumed that Jake had the rings, which causes an "oh shit, they were in the truck" moment of realization, meaning the rings were washed away during the flood. With no rings, it's an "oh no, the wedding is ruined" moment. That is until Bodhi looks down at his father's wedding ring and, with Sharon's help, the day is saved by passing Vince and Sharon's wedding rings to Jake and Violet respectively, giving the rings a second chance at a forever marriage. Cue the dancing montage and apparently the poor guy who plays Molly having to work despite seemingly needing surgery based on Diane Farr's rap pictures. Honestly, I think that between the Sheriff Country bombshell and last season's season finale, a lot of people really wanted a happily ever after ending. They wanted everything to work out and to not find out suddenly on a random Tuesday in September that actually the season finale went horribly starting in the new season. But here's the deal. That's the explanation that you saw in every single Ending Explained article that came out on the day of the finale. You guys expect something much deeper from me. I thought about writing this video as like a little mini essay series all in one video, but as I was trying to explain some of the concepts and line up my thoughts for ChatGPT, it was way longer than I could do in a single video and get it out within a reasonable time span. As I was trying to narrow the story down to explain why Sharon and Bodhi giving Jake Vince's rings felt so right to them and so wrong to the rest of us, I stumbled upon something that I just couldn't shake, that Bodhi saying that giving Jake Vince's rings is what Vince would have done. It just completely ignores the context of the last few episodes that happened when Vince was alive. Though I think that may have actually been on purpose. I can rant to my heart's content and show all the scenes to my mom over and over again, but the people actually present for those scenes were Jake and Vince. I can't hold Bodhi accountable for doing something when he didn't see those scenes. So instead, let me show you those scenes and you can understand what I mean. I've touched on this in various videos, but I want to go a little more in depth here. Let's start with the season 3 episode Dirty Money. In that episode, Vince finds out that Bodhi is helping Wes. Since this is a parole violation and in his career, Vince tells Bodhi, "This place is yours in just a couple of years, don't screw it up." Vince isn't really paying attention to who else is around him, and Jake happens to be standing right there. This situation repeats itself with Jake having a breakdown to Gabriella that Vince hears, and in typical Vince fashion, he walks out. At the end of the episode, Jake apologizes to Vince, saying that he only wants room to grow, and Vince challenges the idea that Jake isn't growing, framing growth not as stripes on your shoulder, but as becoming more skilled at the job. Neither ends the episode particularly happy with each other. Since the thread didn't resolve, it's back one episode later. Unaware that Finn has romantic delusions about Gabriella, Vince invited him to come take photos for the day. Audrey makes a joke about not being camera ready, and Jake tells her if she wants to advance in firefighting, she has to quit 42 as soon as she can. Audrey doesn't get to say anything in response because Sharon and Bodhi start arguing about the actual plot of this arc. This is the episode that Jake decides to call an audible on the rescue and Sharon suspends him. Jake does apologize for telling Audrey to quit, and Audrey says basically the exact thing that Vince did about growth. Then Jake gets a call from Luke and asks Luke when he knew it was time to quit Station 42. This is only a 3-episode plot thread, and it wraps up in eyes and ears everywhere. Jake and Vince sit down to have a drink at Smokey's. Vince grabs his best top-shelf whiskey and mirrors a tradition that he got from his own father about drinking top-shelf liquor while celebrating his son's wins. Vince tells Jake that he doesn't want him to leave, but Jake makes it clear that he's going to leave without a promise to become battalion chief, and Vince won't give him that. But seemingly when Vince dies, Jake sees another chance to take the battalion chief job. He stays at the station during their mourning period, and during the reception after Vince's funeral, Jake lets Eve, Gabriella, and Manny know that he intends to take Vince's job. He and Bodhi get into an argument, and Sharon suspends the station. This leads to Brett getting put in charge. Brett promotes Manny, and Manny promises Jake the battalion chief role when Manny retires. This plot disappears until we get back around to it in Sometimes the Chaos Wins, the episode where Jake demands that Sharon hire Malcolm as an apology for Jake not becoming chief of 42. Malcolm was injured in On the Carpet, and Luke decides not to punish Sharon or Manny for this. Now Malcolm's in complete recovery has shut him out of his previous job. People paying attention at home might point out that Brett decided the chief of 42, not Sharon, but Sharon still agrees to hire Malcolm even though Manny already said no. Jake does this specifically by leveraging what she saw of his relationship with Vince and claiming that Vince intended for him to take the role. So it's at this point that I hope that you can see that there's a bit of a problem with Jake getting Vince's wedding ring. That ring was given to Bodhi by Sharon, which she said was what Vince wanted. It symbolized Vince's eternal love for his son. Sharon tells him that Vince loved Bodhi very much right up until the day Vince died. But as Max Theriot has said, Bodhi sees Jake as being Vince's other son, and both the family axe and the family battalion chief job have now been taken by Jake. But as Eve points out in the season opener, being a community leader does not require being 42's battalion chief. And it wasn't just one ring that was handed over. There were two. Or if you're like the commenter I saw on Facebook, you might say that it was 3 rings because Sharon had an infinity ring and she gave the whole thing to Violet. While I think that Vince's ring symbolizes something for Bodhi and Jake as individuals, I think the cliffhanger for the season is actually about Sharon's ring. This is the part that people found most offensive. They were incredibly angry that Sharon would just take off the ring after Vince being dead for less than a year. But I think that there is a very specific and clear purpose for this. One episode earlier in Rain Check for Tomorrow, Brett Richards shows up having been invited to Station 42 to fill in for Sharon while she goes on vacation. When he learns that she's going on a romantic getaway with her new boyfriend, he questions whether or not she's really ready, sharing that there was a woman after his wife died that seemed perfectly sweet, but he hadn't dealt with his unfinished baggage, and so the relationship was a bit doomed. Sharon denies that any of that is possible, but Brett is quick to point out she is still wearing her wedding set. Sharon does absolutely nothing to work towards what was her baggage in that episode, and then in the last scene she pops off her wedding ring to prove Brett wrong. Meanwhile, Luke is probably somewhere eating Ben & Jerry's ice cream and listening to a Taylor Swift playlist that includes both Ruin the Friendship and Right Where You Left Me. Honestly, I should have known from the moment Brett said unfinished baggage that he was talking about Luke. The season premiere kind of suggests that Luke and Brett may be friends, and Brett is very aware that Luke took care of whatever the backlash was that Danny was trying to create at the end of the season. Even beyond the implication that Brett and Luke are friends, I still think we have better evidence that Brett's unresolved business has to do with Luke. Admittedly, I think the best piece of evidence is that Luke is the only one that knows that Jake and Vince weren't getting along at the time of Vince's death. But also, Luke has been trying to talk to her since the beginning of the season. In the kitchen scene in the premiere, he's making Sunday sauce and explicitly says it's time for them to talk. But he also includes Walter in that talking. It goes badly, but he comes back a couple of days later to try again, which is another close start until his radio goes off and she decides that she has to deal with this. They get another really close chance at the end of the episode, but Brett just happens to ride in his stupid ATV or UTV or whatever it is into the station, and that's it for Luke for the next 10 episodes, other than, I suppose, him trying to go to Smokey's at the end of Fresh Start. We don't actually know whether or not Sharon was there, but in my mind, she saw him enter and immediately ran out the back. Even though they do talk to each other in 2 scenes during On the Carpet, they don't really get a chance to talk to each other outside of official work things until the Elite of the Elite. This is where I started wishing that someone would just lock them in a closet together, or at the very least that they would be in a closet together when an earthquake happened and a heavy filing cabinet fell in front of the door. Luke tries once again to talk to her after the press conference, but she runs away to throw Chloe out of her house and then go play pool with her mom while Luke hosts Rem's tryouts. Luke disappears again to Sacramento or wherever he's supposed to live now until Not Worth the Risk when he comes to the station to work with Bodhi. Then while Bodhi goes off to do hero stuff, Luke goes back and forth between running incident management for the 3-Rock Rescue and following Sharon around as Craig seemingly hits on her. At the end of the episode, Craig says he wasn't trying to get with her. Then she tells Luke she was going to tell Craig she wasn't interested because he wasn't her type. Before she and Luke can start talking though, Jake comes by to ask for AA batteries. While Luke is in the next 2 episodes, it's only 2 scenes each, and all the scenes are with Bodhi and Eve once. Aside from the scenes where they're on opposite sides of the room, Jake and Luke don't have a single scene together. Pretty notable considering the fact that Jake had dubbed Luke his new dad in season 3. Then we can assume that since both the Zabel Ridge fire and the Fraley fire were incidents where Jake was technically in charge, we might see that there could be a reason besides just Sharon wanting it as to why Luke called CAL FIRE on Station 42. But Luke potentially intending to tell Sharon something about what was actually going on with Jake and Vince's relationship at the time that Vince died is just one of the things that Luke could have been intending to tell Sharon. Ruby did spend the last many months of Vince's life blackmailing him, and we never actually found out why. As I was sitting down to write this video, I remember that we never actually went to Vince's P.O. box, so the assumption that Ruby stuff is in there is just that, an assumption. As a reminder, Bodhi found the key when he and Jake decided to break into Vince and Sharon's house to look through Vince's things to get more information about the note. Bodhi found the key and had intended to go by the post office after work, but he ended up giving his mom the note, which leads us down the path towards Ruby and all of that stuff. I think there is an assumption that Vince was using the key as a way to communicate with Ruby, but without having actually checked the box, I don't know if that's correct. And that's only half of the mystery here because we don't know what she was actually blackmailing him over. See, there is a problem because Ruby was pretty convinced she had enough stuff to blow up Vince's life. However, if Vince sending Bodhi away didn't blow up his life, I'm not entirely sure telling Sharon that he was paying off her mom to stay away so she wouldn't hurt herself would do much of anything. I mean, frankly, I feel like if it was just Vince paying her off, Sharon would have berated Ruby for knowing that Vince is easy to manipulate when he's overwhelmed, which is exactly what happens even with Vince dead. But did you notice that Ruby seems very excited to not talk about Vince at all? She dismissed the money he was giving her as vacation money, makes no apologies for being MIA from her daughter's life when Sharon was literally dying. She had the check ready to go though, and while she claims she had it all along, I wonder if that's true. By far, though, I think Ruby's most interesting appearance in the series might just be in The Elite of the Elite, when she called the local news media to leak Tyler's name to the press. Her only justification was that Tyler deserved it for burning down Edgewater and killing Vince, and while Sharon definitely does think he deserved it, it was still illegal. If you don't count the crossover where Ruby forces her way into Mickey's house, this is the last time we see her in the season. And speaking of Zabel Ridge, that is our last unresolved storyline. You see, the story of Tyler's fire, which I do believe, doesn't quite match up with the story of the Zabel Ridge fire. Tyler's fire started in Edgewater in his backyard, and then it went to the neighbors' backyards. The problem with that is that's not how Zabel Ridge happened. At least that's not how the fire is talked about in A Change in the Wind, I Do It Again, or Your Voice in My Head. That fire was started east of Edgewater. 42 wasn't even primary on it. It wasn't until the fire shifted that they were called in. If the fire had started in their territory, 42 certainly would have been the first ones dispatched. That's not even the biggest unanswered question about the fire. This is all the stuff that happened in Season 3. The biggest cliffhanger is the lighter from Smokey's that was found during Your Voice in My Head. Tyler shows up the next episode like a big distraction. There is no explanation of how Tyler would have gotten the lighter, and again, the place where they went to look for the ignition point was in a forest, specifically Zabel Ridge, which is next to Boulder Ridge. It's clearly not near any homes, and if it was, don't you think that was the first place that Agent Ruffin would have checked? I mean, if you want my opinion on what happened, I made an entire video about it, laying out who I think actually did the Zabel Ridge arson. But for now, who did the fire is officially on paper, Tyler McKenzie. I hope this video showed you that while yes, Fire Country lacked its signature, show-stopping, wow factor, cliffhanger that it usually gives us in the last 5 minutes of the episode, but we've got nothing but unfinished storylines, or as Brett may say, unfinished business. But I have no idea what that's going to mean for us next season without just wildly guessing. And that kind of is my point with making this video. Fire Country is switching showrunners and everyone is hailing it as a reset for the series. But the fact that none of these plot lines got solved and that a character drew attention to that fact makes it all feel very intentional. I don't mean in that tinfoil hat Swifties who believe that every single thing she does is an Easter egg way. I mean that if a show is telling us that there's unfinished business and we can easily track down what that unfinished business is, I think it's fair to say Fire Country did get its usual cliffhanger. We just got a very nice dance scene at the end of it as well. Okay, real talk. I don't know what's going to happen in Fire Country Season 5. As of the time of writing this, all of the cast members are off on their various well-earned vacations, except for Max Theriot, who is apparently filming on Sheriff Country this week. We can expect that the show probably isn't going to be back filming until July. Various outlets and even people on Facebook have hoped that Jake's wedding was the symbol of getting rid of the old and starting with the new. However, I can't help but hope that since we spent an entire season building Vince up, now we get to spend an entire season digging into all of the things that he left behind that we still have barely touched. Well, that's about all that I have for this video. I'm currently somewhere in the middle of avoiding watching Season 2, even though I really need to start making notes of the things I want to talk about. The one video every 2 week structure that I tried over winter break is going to be coming back, but I'm also going to try to incorporate a bunch of fun videos so that I can actually take a break, watch Season 2, and maybe make some Has-Been Hotel edits with Fire Country. I will be back in 2 weeks with another video, this time about Sheriff Country and how this show really does shine a spotlight on some of the issues that come with only legalizing marijuana on the state level.